Here we see an image from the city model, the guiding principle working on the old street plan, and similar heights of buildings as to the ones which had traditionally been in the centre of the city. We see on that's the Brandenburg Gate and the Unter den Linden stretching off into the distance, and Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial over on the right-hand side. Now, this is what it looks like. Here we see the Unter den Linden, which under East Germany had all the trees removed. In fact, the trees were removed in the Second World War for firewood and what have you, and it became a parking precinct. So the trees have been replaced. A public boulevard down the centre, seating, public sculpture, public art, kiosks and cafes, 4 lanes of traffic either side, but the street works, and it has linden trees, which is what it was planted with about 600 years ago. Some of the buildings, this is the French embassy right by the Brandenburg Gate. It shapes the space, the traditional Parisiplatz, which is what that space was called. Along a little bit further, on the image on the right, you can see in the distance, you can pick out the Stirling Wilford British Embassy, which is a contemporary take on architecture, but the rather odd building on the right is a stripped-down reproduction of the Adlon Hotel, which was the #1 hotel in Berlin during the Second World War. And it's been reconstructed in a very weak sort of way. Most urban designers would say contemporary architecture which respects its setting, gets the dimensions right and expresses its own time. And we see an example of Foster's addition to a very important building, the Reichstag, and next to it in the government centre, the remains of one of the few buildings which remained from before the Second World War, restored and reoccupied, and new buildings beside it, which are definitely contemporary as opposed to historical pastiche. And of course, they define the streets, they shape the street edges. Now, the 6th point is don't necessarily make it different. Because in architecture, it comes from architectural schools, I'm sure, I know, there's rewards for being original, for being new and different. But originality is not always critical or appropriate in cities. Creativity in design is always important, but should buildings in the urban context be new and startlingly different? The answer to that is yes, in some circumstances. And I like this diagram by Leon Krier, which I'm sure you've all seen before. The top image shows what he calls the monuments, the special buildings that have a public function. They're set in a field of ordinary buildings, which is the bulk of the city, probably 90% or even 95% of the city fabric. Then you put those together and you've got the city. So if we take that approach, and many urban designers do, it's those special buildings that can be, they have to be really, really special, stand out. They might be set back from there in a field of open space, sculpturally dynamic, wonderful, different. Many of the others, they can be, and perhaps should be, more low-key. I put some examples there just to see what this might mean in real life. In the top right, we have Tinnacorry Road in Wellington, which is a character area in Wellington. And there are some old 2-storey shopfront buildings. And with a character design guide which I wrote, and I think it's been taken too literally, there's been a whole lot of reproduction happen there. Now, I think it's a new building which looks old. I think that's probably, it's not necessarily architecture, but it responds to character. It's not necessarily the right approach. In the middle, we have the town hall in Greytown. I think that was an architecture workshop project. You can see on the right-hand side of that an old Victorian frontage looking out into a town square. And then the old facade used to be just a blank wall along the street. Now that has been opened with a wonderful new structure, glazed, which opens the whole hall out to the street edge. So you're getting the reuse of an old building with a wonderful piece of architecture and active edges. So it gets all the urban design ticks. Then down the bottom we have an example of a building which is incredibly sculptural. It's the John Wardle competition-winning scheme for one of the sites on the Wellington waterfront. It's to be a public building with recreational facilities. We haven't quite figured out how to pay for it yet. It's one of the issues. But it sits there, it's a pavilion building in a big open space, and it is dynamic, and it needs to be dynamic. Now, when it comes to public space design, there is real value in getting consistency, largely with the sort of framework, of open space in a city. Melbourne, here's a document which is from a number of years ago now, Melbourne's Urban Design Implementation Strategies. Now, Melbourne has set up designed some wonderful street furniture, some standards for street design, and over 20 years, and street trees, they've been implementing that, building it up bit by bit to a point where Melbourne regularly gets the most livable city in the World Awards for that and other reasons. And even now, the City of Melbourne Draft Urban Design Strategy says, use the public domain to organise the city's fabric, encourage the private domain to enable differentiation. Public works tend to be conceived on a large scale, or if they are implemented gradually, they are controlled so that a consistent result can be achieved over a wide area in a long period. So the message there is the space around the building shouldn't necessarily be the jazzy idea of the day for public space. If it's part of a wider network of city streets, what comes first, the space or the individual project? It's the space. And that's what we've tried to do on the Wellington waterfront. Here you see simple materials, asphalt, the coating of timber inserts reflecting the structure underneath the asphalt, and some standard lighting standards, and even some special round spherical bollards with lights inside them. And those themes are taken through the waterfront.